Hello there, and welcome to Beyond the Surface, where the saying to be seen is to be understood comes to life. I want to begin by first honouring the traditional custodians of the land we live and work on. I live and work on Gundungurra land, and I acknowledge the traditional landowners of my guests near and far. I pay my respects to the elders past, present, and emerging, for they hold the memories, the traditions, and cultures of our First Nations people. The land below my feet is, was, and always will be Aboriginal land. I'm no stranger to the profound journey of pain, grief, anger, and heartbreak that often accompanies the loss of church, community, faith, and the unwinding of our core beliefs. In the midst of this, though, I found healing in the stories shared by others who walked a similar path to me. Here, in the warmth of these digital walls, I want you to feel at home. This is a space where your memories and your story is not just acknowledged, but deeply seen and believed. So kick back, relax, and let's embark on a journey where your story is not just heard, but embraced. I want to welcome you to a community where storytelling is a powerful force. This is Beyond the Surface. Welcome, Mike. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me. I'm honored to be here.
Now, whereabouts in the US are you?
I am in Nashville, Tennessee.
Oh, the home of country music.
Indeed.
Lovely. We've had, I feel like people in Australia know Nashville because of that. We
Yeah.
have we have Tamworth, which is where all of our country people are. Um, okay, so I have been following you for a little while now, probably a couple of years, I would think. And I didn't mention this to you beforehand, but you were actually the very first person that I ever saw online who was publicly both gay and a Christian and a pastor. And so I was like, wow, this is an intersection I have never seen before. And
Nice.
so I'm pretty keen for this episode because I think it is an intersection that, a lot of people don't even know exists, particularly if they are in small towns, and it is pretty rare in Australia as well. Where does your story start?
Oh God.
Mm.
So yeah, this episode goes out to the people in little towns.
Yes.
Um, my stories, yeah, listen, I can that's a dangerous question because like my
I
story,
know.
once I start talking about a part of it, it keeps kind of unraveling, and I won't know when to get off. So
Okay.
do you want to give me like a more defined question so I don't just like take
Uh,
over?
that's okay. Where did Christianity start for you?
I was 4. My parents took
Okay.
me to Sunday school for the first time. I was 4 years old, and I was given the gospel message that they had, and it scared the crap out of me. So I got saved,
Mm,
and then was like in Christianity, in evangelicalism specifically, since then for decades of my life.
yeah, okay. I'm assuming the gospel message heavily focused on hell.
Yeah,
Yeah,
turn or burn, baby.
yeah,
Either get Jesus in your heart or go burn in eternal conscious torment.
yeah, right. Which is also
Yeah,
not where your parents are. So, that tends to be a kicker for kids, right? Do you
right,
want to go to a place where your parents aren't?
right,
Yeah.
forever.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah.
Which, for a kid is a really, really long time. Yeah,
Right.
yeah, absolutely. And so I'm assuming if your parents took you to Sunday school, were you raised in a Christian home?
Actually, at that point, no. My parents got saved through like a business like conference they were at with friends, and then turned their lives around, and we started going to church like from then on, and we were like a Christian home. So we eventually became a Christian family, but before then we weren't. So it started when I was 4.
Right. Okay. Do you
Mm.
remember anything before that? I mean, I obviously am thinking from a therapist point of view. You probably don't, but
I remember I have a couple memories before
yeah.
church. They are few, but I have a couple.
Yeah. And so, what do you remember about being raised in a Christian home? What was that like for you?
Well, let's talk about the good side first because it's the shorter side. I remember, well, God, it's just like I just left evangelicalism like 4 years ago, so it's not like,
Yeah.
there was a lot that changed in that time, but like I remember learning that what God wanted, right? And what the Bible said and how we were supposed to be living our lives and what we were and weren't supposed to do and who was and wasn't in, right? Who was going to heaven and who wasn't. And the perks of being like better than everybody else were nice. Like that was a really nice delusion to be living in. To know everything about everything all the time was nice. Like I miss the certainty. That was really comforting, right?
Mm,
Um, so like those things were benefits, but I also knew I was gay at a pretty young age, and so that was like a huge looming threat
mm,
always in my life. So there were a lot of negative consequences to being a Christian, but I didn't know a lot of them, wasn't able to acknowledge them for a long time because I needed community, right? And I needed my family and I needed my religion. So
mm,
yeah, I ignored any critical thinking for the most part that would go in a direction that I needed meaningful answers and just kind of accepted what they gave me and just like learned how to make it work and interpreted everything around me and other people through the filter that was approved of. So I don't even know if I'm answering the question anymore,
Oh,
but
that's okay. Questions tend to go out the window really quickly with me.
great.
I'm Australian. I just wing life, basically. So, and so I mean, I guess every church is really different in regards to this, but was your church explicitly teaching against homosexuality, or was it just a one?
Yes,
Right. Okay.
explicitly against. I mean, it was in the 90s. I was at a Baptist church, right? Like AIDS had just
Yeah.
devastated the gay community. Very anti-gay. Yeah.
Okay. And so what was that like for you as a young person growing up?
Well, there was a part of me that like was young enough that I didn't really fully understand what being gay meant
Mm,
besides like I liked boys, right? But
yeah.
I had no experience with what that even looked like. And so there was a part of me that kind of hoped that I wasn't gay and just kind of entertained that thought more, like, oh, I'm probably not those people.
Yeah.
Although all the while, like in the background, dreading that I probably was. And then when I was 10, there was this defining like fallout moment where I was like, "Oh my God, I'm gay." Like, no, I am. That's the thing we've been talking about this whole time. I'm that. And so that was a
Okay.
really dreadful moment. But before then, it was like ambiguous enough. I was like not connected to that identity or like understanding enough that like I could escape the threat of it from denial, like I could comfortably deny that. And then from 10 on, it was like, oh God, um,
Mm.
I am that.
Yeah. So how did it shift once you had that defining moment to hearing all of these explicit messages about now not just this ambiguous thing, but who you were?
Okay, Sam, with these interesting specific questions. I love it. Whoa. Well, I guess no one's asked me that before, which is why I'm like
Oh.
reacting that way. This is fascinating. I think for me, like I wasn't conscious of this, but when I look back, I would hear them preach about how homosexuals would not inherit the kingdom, that Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed by God because of homosexuals, right? That they're perverts, they're akin to murderers and child molesters. Like that message,
Mm.
anytime homosexuality was brought up, it was always in that light. So for me, after I was consciously aware that I was gay and no one could know, I just took notes of what the preachers and my parents and my friends and my community thought,
Mm.
right? Like what their talking points were, what their offenses were. I just became very aware of them so I could avoid them, so I could hide from them, right? So I could like be as far away from coming across
Mm.
as one of the illegals as I could. So just took a lot of notes. And some of that was conscious and intentional, and some of it was just subconscious.
Mm.
But like did the best I could to blend in and like not appear gay as much as I was able to do that. Mostly to just avoid, you know, public social ostracization.
Mm.
Um, yeah.
Yeah. What was it like for you internalizing all of those messages when you were, sitting alone in your room without
Oh
having
my God.
to put that mask on?
Well, yeah, when I was alone, no one was around and I'm talking to God, it sounded like, God, please make me straight. Please
Mm.
heal me, fix me, change me. Like I would like to not be broken anymore. Please make me the way I'm supposed to be. Help me figure out how to like girls. Help me figure out how to not like boys. Like it was like that,
Yeah.
like deeply internalized. So like I don't know, for a couple decades, I never conceived of being with a man. Like that did not enter my mind. I never thought of my future with like as a possibility that I could be with a guy. Like that never entered my mind. It was always a dread. Like, how do I get out of this? How do I change this? Because it had been so demonized, you know? So, deeply, obviously, deep self-hatred and shame
Mm.
and like a far off hope that maybe someday God would somehow lightning strike me into heterosexuality.
Yeah.
I couldn't have said that out loud because it sounds ridiculous, but like that was the hope. Because I mean, I didn't have anything else to grab onto. That was
Yeah.
the only thing I could hope is like the God card because there was nothing in my experience that hinted at my sexuality changing in any way.
Mm.
So, when I was alone, it was a dread and a pleading and a please let this be different. And then I would probably disassociate when I would have sexual like
Mm.
fantasies or experiences. I fooled around with my best friend who was a dude for 2.5 years from like middle school into early high school,
Mm.
all the while. So all
Yeah.
those experiences were like very closeted. Like we didn't talk about it. He and I never spoke about it to each other. The lights were always off. There was no dialogue when we were awake together. It didn't happen, which
Yeah.
is really unhealthy, by the way. But
Mm.
so it wasn't like I didn't have any grid for what being attracted to a guy was. I was very aware what it was like and that I was gay, right? But it was also like this thing that I tried to disassociate from and ignore. It was like that thing that happened, and I'm like, oh God, that happened. And we move on, and I'd repent and cry, and and there was just this cycle until one day I just finally cut him out of my life and went like sexless monk for a few years. But yeah, it was like that.
Yeah, I think a lot of people who are not, who have never been part of organized religion or are not part of the queer community don't really understand that it is equal parts internal torture. And people think that the concept of, praying the gay away is just other people praying that for you. But it's not.
Mhm.
It's like you praying it for yourself.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Yeah, it's like that was my most earnest it was my sincerest, most consistent prayer. Like, please, God, make me straight, make me not gay, help me like girls. It was like that stuff in any new forms I could find to the point where it kind of started being like I was taking my vitamins or eating my vegetables, which is like a thing I would do. Just throw it in at the end of each prayer, like and make me straight
Mm,
and heal me and help me like girls. Like just add it to the end of whatever I was praying about constantly.
yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so, how did that impact your personal relationship with God?
Well, here's the thing. My story changes when I'm around 18 years old. Um, I so it's like kind of hard to remember before this because of how dramatic these experiences were, but before I had these experiences, like God started feeling pretty distant,
Mm,
like God was like far away and not irrelevant. Like back then he was a he.
mm,
He was somebody that I, looked up to, adored, worshipped, longed to know better, or whatever. It was God was like this presence of striving and inadequacy in my life, which I think was true for most Christians around me. And so God was more of like an idea and like rule
yeah.
than, but then when I was 18-ish, I had this radical experience that I think was triggered by somebody sharing this testimony about a gay guy playing the main lead role of a Christian film, Tip of the Spear. It was a Jim Elliott movie, and the guy playing the missionary role was a gay guy. And he came out to the team in the middle of the film, and she shared, and they prayed and felt like God wanted him to play the role. And she shared that as a testimony in the Sunday school classroom I was in. and it was so uncomfortable. Like people didn't know what to do with what she was sharing. She was saying it like this was a positive, beautiful thing, and everyone was so uncomfortable because like that was sin, you know?
Yeah.
And so socially it was like a really painful experience. But in the adult service, we're singing the same worship songs we sang every Sunday, and I was different. Something happened to me. And I
Mm.
didn't know at the time, but when I looked back, I was like, you know what? I think that story she shared was a precursor that like got past all my defenses and all of my like guard somehow. And like the notion of God being gracious to a gay person, I had never heard of that idea before in my life. I had never once heard anybody tell me anything that involved God being kind, compassionate, or gracious to a gay person. So
Mm.
she said that, and I had no defense. I had never heard of something like that, right? And so then all of a sudden, I guess subconsciously, probably, there was this possibility
Yeah.
that I didn't think about, but like, what if God was gracious toward me? I guess, right? Would have been. And then in the middle of that worship set, I lost it. I started sobbing because all of a sudden, this presence of God that I'd never experienced like this before was there.
Mm.
God was in the room. I don't, how do you explain that?
Yeah.
And for, depending on whoever's listening, like, listen, interpret this however you need to and translate it. I don't need you to think what I'm saying is true. This is how I experienced it, right? And I wish I had better language now. I don't. But like in from my vantage point and experience, I encountered a person
Mm.
that we call God, and they were so expletive different from everything I'd been told up to that point. They were so different
Yeah.
than the God of the Bible, than the God of the evangelicals. Which when I say that out loud right now, an evangelical listening to me would say, well, then it wasn't God, it was a demon, right? I'm like, okay, look, why don't you sit down for a second.
Chill
This,
out, mate.
yeah, right. Um, read the room.
Yes.
This being, right, was so kind and humble and loving, like in a devastating way. I was not ready, like prepared to interact with or experience this person, and I just lost it. I was sobbing in my seat, and at that point in my life, my emotions were so repressed, and I was so detached from myself that I hadn't cried in years, like about anything. Like I rarely had tears come out of my face at that point in my life. So the fact that I was sobbing out of nowhere was like an alarming sign to me. I was like, what is happening? What is this? And so there was like this sweet, intimate, intense experience of like this person of God, this permission I was all of a sudden being given from
Mm.
something or someone that wasn't human, that all of a sudden I could know God, and that changed my life. Like all of a sudden Christianity wasn't boring or irrelevant anymore. And then 8 months later it happened again, and that was even more intense. And I didn't know this was going to happen, but I started having these experiences like once in a while. I thought the first time was like this one-off, like life-changing moment, that sometimes happens to people,
Yeah.
but then it happened multiple times. And the more it happened, the more acute my ability to comprehend what was happening grew. I became more and more able to like remember and like express better like what I was experiencing in that state or that place or whatever.
Mm.
And I had there were no mushrooms or weed involved in this, right? Like I was not using substances. I was literally usually at church services when these moments would take place. There happened to come
Oh.
times outside of there, but
Yeah, I can
um
imagine people are thinking he's fucking high at this point.
right. Right. I mean, like if I were to try and describe in detail like what the experience was like, I probably sound like someone who is on drugs, like
Yeah.
or tripping something. But like totally sober, having these like radical experiences, and ultimately like my biggest takeaway from a bunch of them was I would not have been able to say this to you out loud then, right? But like in hindsight, I can look back and look at what happened and what I received, I guess, from these exchanges. God was good.
Mm.
God loved not just me. God loved people. Not even that God loved us. God was love. Like we had no idea. Like I had to acknowledge I didn't know what love was before I had these experiences, which was weird because I was like a human being and I was 19.
Yeah.
Like what, But I was like, this is what I think the Bible is talking about when it describes love being patient and kind. It doesn't envy, it doesn't boast, it's not proud, it's not rude or self-seeking. Right? I was like, this this is what this author is talking about. Like this person is these things, right? It was unbelievable. It was so
Yeah.
difficult to describe to people. And I couldn't back then talk about it without losing my mind, like sobbing. I was so exposed and
Mm.
sensitive. So God is good. God is love. God
Mm.
doesn't just love us. God is love incarnate. And I'm like, most of us just throwing that word around, I'm like, we don't know what we're talking about. Like that was wild. And
Yeah.
then like I was shocked, like God was innocent. Like this person was like so I would use the word pure or clean or holy, but like those words have some really negative baggage attached to them, right? So I'm like, I don't, but like the word innocent, I feel like we can connect to it. And I'm like, that actually feels more accurate. I was shocked that this person was innocent. Like they were just so, yeah, I want to say pure and this,
Yeah.
stands the religious garbage, and humble. Like I was shocked at how like lowly of heart is how the Bible, uses that phrase. But like they were so lowly of heart and unassuming. It was shocking. And then this is the much more specific part of this in communication. A few times they told me they wanted me to be gay in the
Mm.
midst of all this stuff I'm describing, right? I'm losing my mind. I'm so vulnerable. I'm so, like so impressionable. And then and all this stuff's coming up. And then they're like, basically, like, I want you to be gay. And I'm like, you can't want that. What are you talking about?
Mm.
Um, so that was like life changing. And it's difficult to kind of conceive of what I thought about God before these experiences because it so radically impacted what I understood about this person or this idea. Anyway,
Mm.
I've completely left wherever we
No, I
started.
love
I will
that.
get off here.
Oh, I mean, and you sort of started to go into it, but my thought was, how obviously your view of who God is shifting and changing and is new. And so how does that then relate to your view of your own sexuality and how long did it take for those two things to line up?
Sam, I don't want to answer that question. Just kidding. Yeah, it's a good question. And it's like really sad to hear my answer. And I wish I had a different one, but this is what happened.
Mm.
I like at 19 for the first time felt at peace with God. Like God loved me, saw me, knew me in my most depraved,
Mm.
unacceptable place, right? This gay part of me. God met me there and affirmed me.
Yeah.
So I would never have said that out loud to anybody around me, but I accepted that from God on some visceral level. Like I am loved, we are good. God is not looking at me with some kind of scrutinizing, discriminatory, exclusive, like judgmental standard that I'm not measuring up to. Like that disappeared. And so
Mm.
that did wonders for my spirituality, right? My identity in terms of my relationship with God.
Mm.
Game changer. But I couldn't say it out loud to anyone because I understood our theology. I wasn't just like a kid that showed up to church. Like I drank deep
Mm.
of the doctrine, the dogma, like the ideology. I was the poster child of evangelicalism. So I knew what I was experiencing was illegal, like would be marked so quickly as deceived or like demon or unclean spirit or deceiving spirit or the devil showing up as an angel of light or what, like any of those options that evangelicals had to disprove or discredit things that didn't align with their interpretations of these ancient texts. So
Mm.
I didn't share these precious life-changing experiences because I knew who was around me. I knew what these people thought,
Yeah.
you know? So God and I, intimate, we were good. Like not just good, we were like, I was being transformed. And it was inspired. Like I was like, how can I help other people get
Mm.
out of the cage of toxic theology? And I wouldn't have even used that phrase back then. And I didn't even understand how toxic it was back
Yeah.
then either, but like
Yeah.
I wanted to give that hope and that peace and that assurance away to others. Um, but I couldn't. I had mentors, pastors, community leaders, family, right? I had a lot to lose. So I
Mm.
never addressed the sexuality part of it. I left it alone for years. So it would be 14 years later that I would finally
Wow.
like acknowledge that I'd finally give in to the genuine sentiment that I had experienced from God all that time ago and like come clean and be like, I'm sorry, you were right. I should have said yes back then. I've been a coward. I've been complicit with harm. I've, benefited from the privilege that I got from pretending to be a straight person.
Yeah.
This isn't okay. And like who I understand God to be had been advocating for that for 14 years by the time I finally came out. So
Mm. And so, how did that impact your relationships during that 14 years? Because that's like almost, I mean, we talk about cognitive dissonance, but that's like on the extreme end,
extreme.
right?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it made me live like in a hazmat suit
Mm,
relationally, like people could only know so much of me before the walls were there or before I was like sleuthy and just would disappear, like there wasn't someone to know.
mm,
There were moments where I would like let somebody in if they got close enough. I would tell them that I struggled with being attracted to men or that I fooled around with my best friend in middle school all those years ago. Like I would treat it like this thing that was far away from the person I was at the time. Um, and most of the friends that I shared that with were like support, like kind and like understanding and compassionate toward me, like probably pitied me a little bit. Um, but yeah, like I wasn't available to be known. I didn't want to know myself. Like I didn't want to accept who I was in the way that I was. So like I wasn't available to others in that way either. Like, so it absolutely stunted what kind of intimacy I was even able to have with platonic relationships.
mm.
When I went through the conversion therapy process, from the ministry school that I was a part of, the advice I was given after I jumped through all the hoops and was scoring, like passing with flying colors, then it was like the next step for me was to date women. So I had dated two girls over the span of the next, 10 years. And both times, like I wasn't attracted to them at all. I mean, they were cool people and we had got along really well. Like we were great friends and they were, they had feelings for me, but I didn't reciprocate it. It just wasn't there. And I wanted to, and I tried and I just couldn't get there. So, yeah, it was like really costly to live like this and try and be a human being. Yeah.
Mm. Okay, you mentioned conversion therapy, and as a therapist, I have a real gripe with that term in general. So I tend to use the word conversion practices because I'm like, let's not
Nice.
call abuse therapy. Let's not have that connotation. Therapy is stigmatized enough. Let's not throw that in the mix.
Nice.
Um, what was that like for you?
I didn't realize how harmful it was at the time, right? That came later.
Yeah.
So it was harmful, but at the time, I was so detached from myself that I didn't even recognize how deeply, I would use the word oppressed, how deeply oppressed I was. Um, I mean, okay, so there are different forms of this process that I got to experience, and there was digging into my past and my relationship with my family members, especially both of my parents, and someone molested me, like, and I literally like did research and like started asking people in my life, did something happen when I was a kid? I'm
Yeah.
not gonna be mad. I just need to understand. And it was so awkward, right? It was so
Mm.
uncomfortable. They're like, what the hell? It was so bizarre. But
Yeah.
they were like gaslighting me into convincing me that something must have happened in my childhood for my sexuality to show up the way that it was.
Yeah.
So that was like that sucked. Obviously, like it continued to like it specifically affirm the message that I was broken, that I was other than, that I was inferior, that I didn't belong, that I had to change in order to actually be part of the community or whatever, right? Like that, those messages were very clear. And so it kind of sends you into this internal isolation. You just like genuinely, like from the deepest place you can consider, feel alone.
Mm.
Like people around me do not understand this. Like some of my closest friends, they were all straight or like, deeply closeted if they were queer.
Yeah.
Um, loved me, saw me, whatever. But like they loved and saw the straight cosplaying person that I was. They didn't even get to know me. And so when they would give me advice or try and be like supportive, even their words would fall flat because I'm like, you have no idea what you're talking about. You don't know what this is like. And I didn't say that to them. I would, I'd thank them for, not throwing me into the dirt. But like, yeah, it was like that. And it was so isolating. I think that was probably one of the biggest like pain points for me was just feeling so separated from everybody else.
Yeah.
Like even gay people were far away from me because I wasn't gay. I struggled with same-sex attraction. So even gay people who like affirm themselves were the enemy. Like I couldn't listen to them. They didn't know. They didn't have the answer. So the straight Christians didn't have answers. Nothing they gave me did anything for me. But then the gay people also had no answers because they were following the devil. And so like you're like alone.
Yeah.
Um anyway, and then so then that can go in lots of directions, but it was like that.
Yeah. And it's like I feel like it's an enormous chasm between those two groups of people as well. And I will often describe my personal experience of feeling like I have one foot on either side of the Grand Canyon, and each side is just trying to like pull me in either direction, and it's like ripping me apart. And all you do is just lose every part of who you are at your core self in that process. And I think it's really hard for people who have not experienced that to really understand just how lonely and isolating and terrifying it is.
Yeah.
A lot of people think when we talk about conversion therapy, they are, or conversion practices, that it is like sorry, it's just like an automatic, I just like
Yeah.
have like a, oh, when I say it.
Yeah.
Um, the everything is at the extreme end, right? So often people will think that conversion practices are exorcisms and, trying to cast out demons and evil spirits and things like that. And so, but we know that it can be much more subtle and less overt than that. What was your experience?
Yeah. There wasn't a ton of deliverance,
Yeah.
casting out of demons going on in my conversion practice experience.
Yeah.
Um, it was mostly inner healing ministry, like, and then counseling. I saw three different,
Counseling in inverted
yeah,
commas. Yeah.
yeah. I saw three different, like, I guess we'd use the word elite counselors in the church space that I was in.
Mm,
And if I think back to the things they said to me, knowing what I know now, I'm like, I don't know if this is legal, like what they said, like what they did and the postures they were in and like the impact that it was having. Like it was
mm,
so the opposite of helpful. It was harmful for me to hear that stuff. Not just hear it, but like take it in and genuinely try and apply this fake idea of what it means to be human to my actual life. Um, so for me, it was like I said, like interrogating my internal family systems and specifically my parents and what did they do to me. And I
mm.
must have had a helicopter mom and an elusive an aloof like absent dad.
Yeah.
And then the awkward thing is like in some ways my parents did fit the bill for those accusations.
Mm,
Um, so like they kind of convince you like, oh yeah, did this happen? This happened? Then that's why. And I'm like, oh God, is that why? And so so that like ultimately it was like less come out of him demon, like that never happened, and more like, hey, is it possible like you're afraid of your own gender and you've like vampirically like sexualized your longing for connection and intimacy with other men and you just need to like you
mm,
need healing in the area of how you relate to your gender, like you just need some strong men around you who like you can be vulnerable with and you can be safe with. And so then they put me I don't even want to get into this 'cause it's so ridiculous. Like I was in the men's sexual purity group, which was ultimately like a sex addiction group for a bunch of guys in the environment who, wanted to come clean and like fix that part of their lives. So they put all the gay guys there that came out, and so these guys would literally they would play games where they would strip down to their
yeah.
underwear and wrestle or like put oil on stuff. And I'm like, what are we doing? Like, this is not helpful for me. And they'd have like these retreats. And then I don't know why, but the guys wanted to get naked in the woods on these retreats.
Mm.
And the gay men are there. And we're supposed to like be like draw closer to these masculine, butch, macho
Oh.
dudes who are taking their clothes off. And it's supposed to be healing for us. And I'm like, you guys do not know what you're doing. This is
Mm.
ridiculous. Right. And like I could tell you so many stories and
Oh.
it's like laughable, and you would think that I'm making it up because it's so
Mm.
ridiculous. But that's literally what was going on. And that was one aspect of the conversion
Mm.
journey, right? And that was supposed to like help me become straight. It did not.
No.
Anyway, like yeah, I could anyway, it's all
Oh.
it's the
I mean, it's the most ironic thing. Like it just could not get more ironic. Like I feel like you could play Alanis Morissette's song over that because it
right.
was just like, and you hear that time and time again when you hear about people talking about conversion practices and that, they're part of a group and there's like, it's literally just a bunch of gay men largely, and it's like, how is that going to be helpful? Like, you just stick a bunch of people who are attracted to the same gender of the people that they're in with, and we're all struggling with the same thing. And it's like, oh yeah, like it's like the point is over here and you're all the way over here. Like it's just gone straight over their head that would not be helpful. Um, how did I mean, I'm thinking I hate the notion, obviously, that trauma some way is the reason that somebody is gay or trans or whatever. How did that impact your relationship with your parents?
I don't know that it got very far. Like I pursued evidence, like I had conversations with them and which were awkward for the record. Like I don't know if anybody should have to like have those conversations, but unless, there's actually something that needs to be addressed. But I don't know. My parents and I were pretty established and like close in the ways that we made work. So I don't even know that this stuff directly impacted how I saw my parents or related to them. Um, yeah, I think it went more inward. Like I just became more and more reminded that I'm not like other people. They're not like me. I don't belong. I'm not good enough. I don't fit in. I'm fundamentally missing, like the baseline of what it means to be an acceptable, upstanding man in Christian culture. So I think it mostly was targeting and impacting my personhood, my self-image, my
Mm.
self-esteem, my self-worth. Yeah. And I think because by that point, my boundaries with my parents were pretty established anyway. So like I didn't feel super vulnerable toward them in the process anyway. So anyway,
Yeah.
yeah.
And so, how did you progress to being a pastor?
Well, so I use the term pastor more colloquially, because so I got kicked out of school. I got outed on the last day of second year from a friend of mine. And that was like a traumatizing experience. I didn't
Mm.
graduate and
For the
then had to
record,
like,
if anybody's listening, don't ever out someone.
yeah, outing people,
Ever.
not helpful.
No.
It's not helpful. It's the opposite of helpful.
Mm.
Yeah, so had to recover from that. And then like I confronted the people who kicked me out of school a few months later because I had friends in my life who were like, why didn't you graduate? I'm like, what do you mean? And they're like, okay, I get what happened. Why didn't you graduate? I'm like, what?
Mm.
So, the school, the guy who made the decision to kick me out apologized, gave me my diploma, whatever. Then I got hired on staff at that church that had the ministry school. I worked there for a few years. And then I started teaching at the school that I got kicked out of.
Mm.
And I started teaching on the gift of discernment and spiritual intelligence. And my class blew up. Like students were very interested, I think, in the content itself, but then also I was a different kind of teacher in that environment than the other teachers. Because Bethel had its own very specific culture, right? Like its own vernacular and like ethos and whatever within Christianity. And I just didn't want to hook, line, and sinker like become one of like a Bethel person. Even though I was a Bethel person, I still wanted to speak in a way that was relatable to people who didn't live within that echo chamber. And so I was intentional with my verbiage. And then I also like thought critically and like brought emotional health into the supernatural stuff that we all just like threw around and like expected accountability in it. And I took my craft seriously, and I think people were attracted to that. I think it like legitimized, like some of the things we were teaching or like wanting to practice and experience and made it like palatable and maybe even relevant to life outside of Bethel Disneyland.
Mm.
I think, I don't know, that's me just kind of trying to piece these things together. But for whatever reason, like students flocked to my class and it just kind of popped off. And so for 5 years, it just kept growing and growing. And all the while I also like had other opportunities and I just kept becoming more platformed and more visible. And then I started being invited to travel and speak all over the world. And so I went and spoke at conferences and workshops and preaching at churches and stuff like internationally. And it was awesome. I was living my dream. Like I had arrived. And every once in a while, in the midst of all that stuff, I would still have this like, I would have a moment with God, like, oh, remember God, right? And they would show up and like eke at my sexuality, at the depth of my capacity to be authentic. And I'm like, God, I am successful. Don't you dare ruin this, right? I didn't ever say that, and that's an
Read the
oversimplification.
room, God.
Exactly right. Yeah, and so like I just had to start working against the spirit of God in my life in order to maintain my Christian success, you know? The irony in that. And then eventually so yeah, so I was doing that. I had mentored several like years of interns, you know, and just had this like community of students who were very invested in each other and like me as a leader and you know what I was doing in the world. And it was a wild time. And there's so many things I would do differently now based on what I know now. But back then, like, I don't know, there were things that we didn't know. There were things we didn't want to know.
Mm,
And that like enabled some harmful practices that I look back and I'm like, oh my God, like
yeah.
I think of myself as like an unsafe leader back then. And I've talked to some people in that who were in my on my team back then. And, you know, their feedback to me was like, you were the safest leader I knew. And I'm like, oh, thanks. That's not my memory of it. But, you know, I think we're also like our harshest critics, you know. But that was what I did. So vocationally, I also like had some businesses on the side. I ran businesses for my income. I was not dependent on any of this ministry stuff for income in my life. So everything I did at Bethel was for free, basically. Like I was doing, I was doing it all for free eventually,
Mm,
and just becoming more and more successful at it. And then I started becoming like I think a problem because like I wasn't in their pocket. They couldn't like threaten me with loss of income or a loss of a job. But you know, like some of the leaders knew like that about my stint. Like they're like, that dude's gay, you know, or like I was single and like dating women wasn't working. And so I'm like becoming the successful, like late 20s, early 30s single guy in Christian ministry. And you get some side eyes when you're that age and single, you know, like there's an
yes.
absolute discrimination against single people within Christian culture. If you're not married by 22, like something's wrong with you, you know?
Hmm. Yeah.
So yeah. Anyway, that's what I was doing when
Mm.
I came out. Yeah,
I mean, it sounds like you became a liability to them, realistically.
absolutely. I was such a flashy,
Yeah.
charismatic liability. Yeah.
And I mean, the fact that the people on your staff said that you were safe is probably a comparative to the feeling of unsafety that the other leaders brought also.
Yeah.
Because I think one of the hardest things that a lot of people deal with when they might leave their former church or they start to deconstruct or whatever language they use is realizing the harm and the system that you helped uphold, and so it's like that's hard to look back on, I think, for a
Yeah.
lot of people. Yeah.
Yes. Absolutely.
What is
Really painful.
what is that like for you to look back on being a part of? I mean, Bethel is well known. Like it's real well known. I went to they did like a stint here in Australia of like worship nights, which was my first experience of Bethel. And I was like, what on earth is this crazy shit? Like, what is this? What is happening? Like, I'm from a conservative little church where like we would not, it was like hard to get them to sing Hillsong because it was too me centric. Like, you do not raise your hands. Like, that was focusing on you. And I had been to
Wow.
Hillsong a couple of times, so I was not unfamiliar to that. But I went to Bethel, and there was obviously spontaneous worship and things like that. And I turned to, which, this doesn't work either. I turned to my girlfriend at the time, my now wife, and I was like, what on earth is this? Like, what are we at? Like, it was crazy town to me. I was like, oh my goodness. So Bethel is well known. And so what is it like for you to look back on being a part of that system?
Like you said, it's painful.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Okay. And so before I say anything else, I want to just acknowledge the people who run Bethel, lead, whatever, like the people I knew, and I
Mm,
knew a lot of them, especially like higher up, influential, like public facing people. I, I'm saying this from the bottom of my heart. They are genuine,
mm,
kind, well-meaning people. Like they genuinely think they're doing the right thing. And I just deeply disagree.
Mm.
But to speak to their character and their intentions, like these are good people. I want to just acknowledge that. I don't want to, I'm not trying to throw them under the bus because I'm just mad. I
Yeah.
am mad and I am going to say some like exposing things, but it's not because I want to retaliate or like harm them. These are, and that's part of the tension is because these are actual human beings and they mean well. I
Mm.
genuinely believe the majority of the people there do mean well.
Yeah.
Bethel is run like a business. And that's, I don't know if that's unique to Bethel, but I think Bethel, maybe more so than other churches, was like I don't know what a manufacturing plant of like intellectual property.
Yeah.
Sorry, not was, is. I would say one of the higher values of Bethel culture, not preached from the front, not practiced by the layperson, but absolutely that helped get it to become as influential and successful as it is like it's a capitalist
Mm.
space. Like they highly prioritize profit, which, like I don't know if I have a problem with that in general, but when you start mixing that with people's spirituality, with religion, with tuition, conference, I'm not gonna say that what they're offering they shouldn't get value for. I think it's fair and appropriate, and obviously there's a market for it.
Yeah.
But when you've got vulnerable people showing up to the ministry school with these hopes and dreams, and that the marketing of the school is be a son or daughter of the kingdom, and then there's this promise of you being that in the house, and this language carries with it so much meaning that people who don't understand that context won't translate, right? But
Yeah.
there's all these promises and vision of come change the world, come become a world-changing revivalist, come be an encounter of God for people, like. And to be fair, like there is a very established culture that creates a kind of person that kind of emulates these ideals
Mm.
and potentially could transplant them to other cultures, right? But when you've got a bunch of pastors who have a bunch of students that they're responsible for, who these pastors are actually behaving more like managers and they have students to kind of run through the conveyor belt, but the students are like their hearts are open and they're probably in some of the more vulnerable positions they've been in a long time. Their hopes and dreams, their ugliest secrets are coming up, and these
Mm.
pastors are just kind of running them through the
It's like
the
a conveyor
processing
belt.
plant. Just
Yeah.
to get through it. And
Mm.
the amount of like terrible conversations and poorly handled like confronting dialogue from leaders, and maybe even especially who like lacked some important skills to be handling people in those contexts. I've heard so many horrible stories of like pastors I knew who are good, intelligent, like emotionally intelligent people,
Mm.
treated people poorly and had really bad results in terms of how they impacted students. And it's not because they're bad people. I think it's because they're overworked and they have just way too much on their plate. And it's because they're just running human beings through this machine like cattle because it's profitable. And I'm like, this is not fair. And I saw that problem while I was there. Having come out and then people just seeing me as a lightning rod of a safe space because I've defected from Bethel, they just like kind of purge their horror stories of being there. And so I've gotten to hear a lot of horrible things about like how they were treated and how they experienced it. And I'm like, oh my God. And I have my horror stories, right?
Mm.
So I think back on that and I'm like, man, the system itself set all of us up for failure. And I don't know that it's like an innocent byproduct of stuff. I think there were some people intentionally creating an environment that ultimately like exacted those consequences. And so those people I think are responsible for this.
Yeah.
And, so that sucks. And then I have to look back at myself and how much I participate, how successful I
Mm.
was in participating in that system. I was. And it shaped me in a lot of ways that I had to like relearn how to be a person in some of this because it was not good.
Yeah.
And then there's also like an intense celebrity culture at Bethel, right? So I actually kind of felt dehumanized while I was like a who's who to whatever degree I was. Like I kind of started shoving people away and like not being available to have relationship with people because I felt like a piece of meat. I felt like I was just a resource people were trying to get a hold of and use, and it was like exhausting. And that's not good, right? And it's not their fault. Like these people are that was what was promised to them, And anyway, so I think there's a lot of that going on that's just not managed well.
Mm.
Um, but then like when you get into the actual like theology,
Mm.
and like what you're telling people God wants, God is saying, what you're telling people they are or they aren't. there's a lot of overreach and there's a lot of ignorance on issues that we actually do have a ton of research and substantiation to like support a way that people should be treated and subjects should be handled that get completely ignored, disregarded, refuted in that space. There are so many queer people
Mm,
that flock to Bethel. And the irony is that Bethel has an anti-gay, ex-gay, they say it's not a ministry or whatever it is, right? Like,
yeah.
and the thing is, like, I know both the people who co-lead that thing, and they're both like super cool, genuine people. And
Yeah.
I think what they're doing is toxic and harmful and like so not okay.
Yeah.
So sorry, I'm getting again, like, I
No,
mean,
that's
God,
okay.
this is just it's there. I'm just gonna give you
Yeah.
that.
I mean, it's so I just think it's hard when you start to mix a business plan in a spiritual space that just loses people's humanity. I think, that's
Yes.
where I mean, I've seen your shirts where they say humans matter more than theology. And I think it's, when church is a system and a business, you lose people's humanity. And I mean, churches naturally draw vulnerable people. It
Right.
and so you are not, churches are not preying on the elite, they're preying on the vulnerable. So
Right.
it just
Right.
is, losing humanity, losing empathy for some of the most oppressed, marginalized, and vulnerable people in society.
Yeah.
Um, and I think it's hard not to get mad about that and in uproar.
Yeah.
Yeah. When
Absolutely.
did when did things implode for you?
It was I have like very specific dates. So picture this. February 1st, 2020. We are
Oh,
about to go into a global lockdown, right? I
yes.
watch Miss Americana on Netflix, which is Taylor Swift's documentary that came out on January 31st that year.
Yep.
I watched it by myself in the living room, and halfway through the film, have you seen the movie?
I haven't, but I do.
Okay.
I do. I'm a fan of Taylor. Yeah.
Nice. Okay. I mean, you'd enjoy the movie. Halfway through the movie, she goes hard on politics, which she had never done before. And then specifically for like a minute or a minute and a half, she goes hard on gay rights and like advocating for gay people. And there was a moment where that was happening, and I felt at which what I would acknowledge as spiritual conviction in that moment. And I was shocked. I was like, what is happening? Every time Taylor Swift said anything about the queer community, I just kind of ignored it. You know what I mean? Like it was just like, okay, thank you for that. Can we move on? Like I just like had to shove it away, right? And then this
Yeah.
time it was different. She starts going off, and I can feel this like
Mm,
dangerous rumbling in my soul. And all I knew was she knows something I don't, or she's touched something that I haven't yet, and she's right. Like I'm missing something. And it
mm,
was a spiritually unsettling experience. I knew that this was like not just like a no wonder like my brain just like trying to process something. My spirit, maybe, right? If you would use that language, was being uh, uh harassed in a good way, right? Like provoked,
yeah.
threatened. And then 2 weeks later, I am processing some painful things I'm experiencing from specific leaders, like high up leaders at Bethel. I had been treated in a certain way. And I was so mad. Like it was unfair. Like if I told you some of the things that happened and the explicit stuff these people said to me in the context that it was said in, it's like horrible. It's horrible. And so I'm sitting there processing, so mad. I'm like out loud talking to God in my living room. And then I get interrupted. And this had never really happened before. Like maybe not never, but like it was not common for me to experience this. I got interrupted in whatever I was saying by a passage in Acts where Peter goes up on the roof and falls into a trance, right? And I was like, what in the it was so random, like out of nowhere. But I could feel again, like something's happening. So I pulled out my phone, pulled out the story. It's on Acts 10. Peter goes up on the roof, falls into a trance. A sheet comes down from heaven. In the sheet is all these animals that God has forbidden Jewish people to eat, right? And God says, rise, Peter, kill, eat. And Peter says, no, Lord, I've never eaten anything unclean. And God says, don't call anything unclean that I've made clean. Happens 3 times. The sheet goes back up, right? And so then I stopped reading. And I'm aware whatever is happening right now happened 2 weeks ago with Taylor. Like it's the
Yeah.
same thing. What is this about the gay thing? Is this about gay people? Like, is God trying to tell me that being gay is acceptable? Right? Like that maybe at some point it wasn't and now it is. Like that feels like a reach. I can't justify that. So I ignored that experience, pushed it away. 3 weeks later, I'm in the woods behind my neighborhood yelling out loud because I'm so mad. I'm trying to process the stuff that's happening with leaders at Bethel. And then I get interrupted again. This time it's a passage in the Gospels, Luke and I think Matthew. Jesus is rebuking the teachers of the law. He says, you heap rules and requirements on the people without lifting a finger to help them. He goes off about the prophets and their tombs and the hypocrisy of this generation. And then he concludes this this rebuke with,
I mean, it's kind of is a rant.
he's kind of ranting, yeah.
Yeah.
You prevent people from entering the kingdom while you yourselves refuse to enter. And keep in mind, like these passages that came up, like I'm very familiar with them. They're not new to me, but I had never experienced them in this context before. And all of a sudden it's being like brought up. In the Bethel world, we'd call this a rhema word, right? Like God is speaking in this instance with these old words, saying something new to me, right? Which we had context for. And so I read that, and then when I stopped reading it, like it was the third time I was having that same trembling, soul-ruining experience. And by this third time, right, like you prevent people from entering the kingdom while you yourselves refuse to enter. Once I finished reading that sentence, like that was the moment.
Yeah.
I don't remember exactly how you phrased your question, but it was right then. There was build up to it, right? It wasn't an overnight moment. There was context before Taylor too that I'm sparing for the sake of time, but in that moment, I realized for the first time in a way that I could not avoid or excuse or justify, like I am heaping rules and requirements on people and myself without lifting a finger to help any of us. I am preventing people from entering the kingdom while I myself am refusing to enter. Like this is happening. And it's not just me. Like it was like a rebuke hit me and then it hit everybody I was connected to in ministry. All of us, we are doing this. It was a rebuke from God, you know? And I was like, I cannot do this anymore. Like I am on the wrong side of this conversation. It's kind of like, you know, Saul being converted to Paul, like gets knocked off his donkey or whatever. And Jesus is like, I'm the one you're persecuting. It was like that kind of oh my God, like I'm part of the problem. This isn't it. And then all this stuff from the last 14 years of the Spirit of God affirming my sexuality, like approving of me as a gay person, drawing my heart out to the surface, wanting me to, you know, like all just comes crashing in this like damning expose, and I cannot recover. And so that day I decided, okay, I'm going to listen. Like my spirit was moving to the place where I was like, I have to move here. I can't stay where I am. This has to change. But my mind still had all of the toxic theology, the Bible, right? Like just holding my mind back. And I was like, I'm okay. I'm going to do the work. It felt like Frodo with the ring and Mordor is like so far away. I'm like, how am I ever going to get there? Like, I don't even know how long this is going to take. How long is this going to take for me to figure this out? But okay, I'm going to do it. I'm going to listen to anybody saying anything affirming of the queer community. I don't even care if they're Christian or not. I just need to hear someone say anything different than what I've heard my whole life. And then it didn't take as long as I thought it would. But yeah, like 9 months of solid research. And by the end of that period of like looking into this, I was like, we are assholes. We have missed it. We are not being honest. We have not done our due diligence. We are bigoted. We have a bias and we have an agenda. This is not God. And how dare we use the Bible and the voice of God or the kingdom of heaven or whatever to justify our laziness or our fear or our projection or whatever this is. It's just not the truth. It's not accurate. Like we cannot justify homophobia and like discrimination with the Bible. It's not in the text, you know? And so that was a game changer. What did you ask me?
Well, I asked when it imploded, and I think you answered
There
that.
you go. That's the answer. That was the extended version, but yeah.
Were you still at Bethel for those 9 months, or you
Yes.
left?
Oh my God. No, I was
goodness.
there. But you have to realize this was during the pandemic. So I wasn't physically going to Bethel Church. I was like, you know, quarantining or whatever. So thankfully there was that cover of just not going anywhere, not seeing anyone. So I got to be like a mad scientist, just losing my mind at home, reading queer affirming books and queer theology and deconstructing. And yeah.
Oh my goodness. And so at the end of that 9 months, did you make a conscious decision to leave Bethel, or did that just happen naturally?
That's a good question. I decided, so in between that 9 month period, I was talking to people and coming out to them. So even while I was doing research and learning, I was still like actively coming out to people because I knew like my heart had moved. I'm like, I have to like identify as a gay person just to like align with my convictions. Like I am a liar if I don't do this. So like so that was happening. And then at some point in that, I talked to the leader that kicked me out of school all that time ago. And then, like I'd been working with him ever since. Sat him down. I was like, here's what's happening. And I told him my story and he listened. And then he told me, Mike, like gay people go to heaven. God loves gay people. That's. But the moment you choose to pursue a man, like you're no longer following Jesus. And I was like, okay. And I knew at that point, like, I think I'm done. I'm not gonna like. I can't. What am I supposed to do? Like these guys, he's not listening to me. He let me talk and then told me what I needed to think after this. Like this is not a conversation. This is not a relationship. This person is not listening to me. I'm not gonna waste my life trying to like talk to people who don't listen. Right? I
Mhm.
talked to the guy who's in charge of change and the woman who co-leads it, and they like turned on me. It was shocking. They were cordial, they were civil, but I was genuinely shocked, especially how like the guy just like treated me like he didn't know me. Like all of a sudden I was a threat, I was somebody else, and we'd known each other for 10 years by that point. And he had known about my struggles that whole time. So I was like, how did this but I'd crossed the line, like I betrayed him, which I understand in some ways, but in other ways I'm like, bro,
Mm,
you still could have been like a person to me.
yeah.
Anyway, so after some of those experiences, I was like, I can't do this. Like, I don't think I can come out and like look after myself and genuinely give myself the opportunity to explore while all of this is going on, looming in my backyard, looking like breathing down my neck. Because I also just had a bunch of people who like regarded me as a leader at Bethel, in the community. And Bethel was like 10% of the city at that point. Like this, they're not no one. They're like
Yeah.
pervasively throughout Reading. So I was like, man, Mike deserves the opportunity to come out. And I tried dating a couple people, and it just was so difficult to
Mm,
find out people who still like cared about stuff that I cared about. And so I was like, I got to get out of here. I'm not safe here. These like the people that I've known as my community and my whatever, they do not see me. They cannot hear me. And there's nothing I can do to change that. Like there's a while where I thought if I just said the right things, or if I like it was compelling enough, if I provided enough evidence, and then enough after enough of these conversations, I was like, oh, this isn't about evidence. This isn't about the truth. This isn't about like substantiating what you think is true. Like this is about defending a belief and
yeah.
doing whatever you need to support why your belief is superior. And I was like, my humanity and my vulnerable like story and testimony and experience is not worthy of being treated this way. I deserve better than this. So then the talks started coming of like relocating. And in that time, I had found a mentor, someone that I was going to make be my mentor, who lived in Nashville. He was doing incredible work, like for inclusion of queer people within evangelical spaces.
Mm,
Brilliant, like addressing the subject and the terrain in a way that I hadn't seen anybody do yet. I was is very impressed. So I went and visited him. We had coffee a couple times. I sobbed after the first time I met him. Just with some friends afterward. I just like bawled my eyes out because I had never in my life had the experience of sitting across from a church leader who knew I was gay and didn't bat an eyelash, didn't need me to
mm,
change, wasn't going to put me on some purity plan afterward or like some kind of accountability regime that I had to like check back in, like uh regimen. Sorry. That was fascinating. And like it was a game changer for me. I had never experienced someone like that in my life in that context. And so I was like, I got to get around this person. So
mm.
the reason I moved to Nashville was just to get more around him. And he was very instrumental in helping me come out publicly, like brace myself, do the work, and prepare myself for the public onslaught. That was a nightmare. I'm so thankful that I had people like him. It wasn't just him, but like he was a major contributing factor to my ability to stay sane throughout that process.
Yeah.
Again, we have like completely abandoned the question, but yeah.
Oh, that's okay. I didn't care about questions. Um,
Great. Good.
I but my next question was going to be, what was it like for you to come out publicly? Because it's one thing to come out to a single person who you are sitting across the room from, and it is another to announce that to the whole world.
Yeah. Yeah, it was very different. So I shot a 1 hour YouTube video, basically just like telling my story. Trying to be as like honest and like sharing as much relevance as I could without overbearing people with too much of my story.
Mm,
Shot it. shared it with people in my like who were like current clients of mine and any of the business things I was offering in that context. So they watched it early and then got to react and whatever. And then 3 days later, I published it on February 1st, 2022. So 2 years after the date of Taylor Swift's when she
Yeah.
ruined my life. Um, Published that video, right? And then the comments came, so it was the text, the phone calls, the comments, the DMs, and there were so many avenues and channels for people to be able to express their disapproval, their hate, their judgment, their disappointment, whatever. I had a few speaking gigs lined up for the year, and within that week, they were all canceled. They had all reached out to me and like informed me that I was no longer welcome to come to that conference or that church or whatever. And I knew it was going to happen, but it was still painful to have to actually have those conversations and be rejected.
Mm.
So it was really painful. It was scary. It was a rush. It's a weird way to say that, but that's true. Like it was thrilling in one sense, right? And terrifying at the same time. And then it was also so painful. Mostly because like I didn't really care as much about what people I didn't know on the internet were saying, like whatever, I don't know them, right? But there were people who knew me, people who like came to conferences that I hosted and like put on, or like subscribed to things I did, or were former coaching clients of mine or whatever. People who like cheered me on and championed me and really cared about what I was doing. And then all of a sudden,
Go on.
I'm being led astray. I'm possessed by a demon. I'm worshiping Satan. I'm a false prophet. I'm deceived. Like all of a sudden, and it's like this language. They're not just like, hey, I disagree. They're like, hey, you are being used of the devil. You are leading all these people astray. You are calling sin something God, and it's like, yeah. So that was a lot of that. And it just kept happening. And because people didn't all see the video at one time, people kept finding it out later and later and later. So the comments just kept coming in delayed waves of updates. And so there was like probably 2 months into this experience, I started going into a black hole. Like I started getting kind of dark in my emotions. I would wake up the next morning, like I'd go to bed, not excited about the next day. I'd wake up, not excited to get up, which had not happened in a long time. And I was like, oh shit, am I depressed? Like, is that happening? Like, whoa, when did this happen? And that's why I had to like start getting very intentional about managing my time, my energy, what I was doing on a day-to-day basis. I started going on walks regularly, getting in the sun, moving my body. I got a therapist. I was like talking to friends and just trying to continue to keep the dialogue in front of me instead of just like in my head. Yeah, so I had to like my lifestyle had to change. I had to like figure out how to like manage my life differently in order to support the level of like anxiety and stress and like emotional upheaval that I was experiencing every time I opened my phone. It got to a point where I didn't even open Facebook anymore. I just stopped checking Facebook because those comments were the most horrific of all of them. Facebook people are crazy.
Oh, they are awful, right?
They are the worst. I don't know why is it
Yeah.
on Facebook, but like
Oh,
Facebook is where the worst, most
I
horrific,
know.
toxic people are participating.
Mm,
Absolutely. So now to this day, I literally check Facebook like once every few weeks. I don't look at it because it's just so
yeah.
nasty. And then so part of that process too, like I started like kind of I started becoming like a documentarian with the stuff that I was getting and like showcasing comments and DMs and stuff and using them as teaching points and
Mm,
exposing the horrific stuff that was being said to me. It was so absurd, like the dehumanizing accusations that were coming at me. And like when you knew me as a human being, you're like, none of this is accurate. I am not this person. Like I have integrity. I have morals. I'm a person of my word. I genuinely care about people. Like I am not this. This is what
mm,
are we talking about? So,
yeah.
but then I used these comments and DMs and accusations where there were lots of Bible verses, especially to help detoxify people's theology from the haters and bigots. And mostly so I could just show other queer people who were in the closet, terrified of experiencing what I was going through, like
Mm,
just showing them, hey, there's life on the other side of this, and there needed to be, right? Like I was going to survive this, and I wanted to show other people that they could get through it. So I started alchemizing the toxicity and then using it as like content. And I was like, if I'm gonna talk about anything, I want to talk about this because this is like so intense and constant. And I was avoiding it. I was blocking people left and right. I was like trying to not see DMs and like deleting them. But I found that it was actually haunting me. Like as I
yeah.
kept running away and avoiding it, it just felt like more and more threatening. So I was like, I can't keep running from this stuff. I've got to face it. So I started reading the horrible comments and then processing through it, like talking to friends, getting so upset, letting the emotion move through my body. And then I would try and be as constructive as I could be responding to the thing, not to the person.
Mm.
I would often block the person who made the comment, but use what they said as a teaching point to give my response to this. Here's why this is invalid. Here's why this doesn't make any sense. This is why this is an ignorant interpretation. This, and it was like a really helpful thing. And people just, I think, really like bought in. They really appreciated it because one, they don't get those comments, especially if they're closeted, right? Nobody thinks to say that to them. But then two, if those comments came, they got to feel clear in their conscience because I debunked and exposed in an educated, informed, like articulate way why this comment is invalid.
Yeah.
Not trying to react to my haters or change their minds, but using their hate to educate my audience, both the people who were bigoted and still watching me, and then the people who were in the closet terrified of this ever happening to them, like, and then so after that, it started becoming a lot more constructive, and then it started becoming kind of fun. And then I started like laughing at a lot of these comments because they're just so ridiculous. And so I know that I can share stuff now that's kind of triggering for people. And to me, like sometimes it's genuinely hilarious to me because I've done it so much that it doesn't hit me personally anymore, hardly ever. This isn't about me. Anyway, so coming out publicly was traumatizing and horrific, and then it was a journey, and now like has become kind of like a stepping stool to like further help the people I wanted to be helping in the first place,
It's like an extreme form of exposure therapy that you did to
Yeah,
try and
totally.
desensitize to what was coming in. But I think, often when I have, seen those posts that you've made, I think there is a third thing that happens, which is for people who are getting those messages to see someone modeling, how can I respond to this as well? Like if I'm getting these from people that know me and having absolutely no way, on how to respond to that, without seeming like I'm just bitter and angry, to be able to respond to that in, like you said, an articulate way, that's not overtly, emotional or hateful or anything like that. And so what is it like for you now to be getting messages from people who say that you've been instrumental in their journey?
I mean, it's so humbling, right? Like, I feel very honored, privileged to get to do this. I'm getting emotional.
Mm.
That's surprising. Yeah, it's like a traumatic experience to be queer in evangelical spaces.
Yeah.
Just full stop, right? Just in general. So, I mean, that's the big part of why I do the work that I do is like I want to help the people who are trapped in the closet within their own worldview, their own identity, like evangelicalism taught me to hate myself. And so getting to use my education and my experience and my platform to defang the source of spiritual authority in most of these people's lives feels really redemptive to me. It feels like I get to like stab the dragon in the heart, that like ruined my life for so long. And to know that what I've been through and that what I continue to put labor toward is impacting people and helping them. Yeah, like brings, obviously it's like really fulfilling, but like is redemptive, and like helps not justify, but like helps me come to terms with like what I went through and what I lost and the torment that I had to go through feel a little less horrible, and at least like gets to be used towards something beautiful and constructive and helpful for people. And like I think I try to be and say, somebody, and I try to be somebody and say things that I wish someone like me 5-10 years ago could have seen. And so I think it's really cool that people now get to have that in so many ways. It's not just me. There's so many people like me out there doing this, but not 5 years ago, not in my world, like it was, the algorithm did not let me see any of them. I wouldn't have listened anyway, even if I had. So the fact that I'm getting to like impact people in that way just feels really meaningful in so many ways. It's like really redemptive.
Yeah. And so I'm, down when we talk about religion in Australia, it's so different to religion, the religious landscape in the US. And I will often say that it's, it's a bit of a shit show over there in the US in terms of the
You're
way
not
that,
wrong.
yeah,
Yep.
in the way that like religion is just so enmeshed in every part of society. And so, knowing that you still identify as a Christian, how do you balance that with the hatred and the oncoming shitstorm that Christianity poses
Yeah.
to queer people in the US?
Yeah. Good question. It's a vigilant effort for sure.
Yeah.
There was like probably like 9 months ago-ish. I don't know if that's real, but somewhere back then, I genuinely had the question in my heart, like, am I a Christian anymore? Like, is that true? Is that accurate? Is it fair? Is it honest for me to still hold that label? Because of how different my beliefs are now, you know? And like what I would have defined as a Christian back in the day, I'm like, I'm not that anymore. I don't qualify. I'm not that person. So like me 4 or 5 years ago, I would not identify as a Christian now if I believe and don't believe what I do now in
Yeah.
that guy's mind. But that guy was also ignorant. The guy was so
Mm,
there's a lot of problems with what that guy knew and didn't know.
yeah.
So there is so much about what the word Christian, the label, the identity Christian communicates to the general population that does not represent
Yeah.
me, my convictions, my beliefs. So in some ways, it would be really liberating and helpful to not have that label anymore. But here's the deal, like the bigots and the haters and the worst forms of Christians in the world don't own Christianity. Doesn't belong to them, you know? That's true. And I've had to process through this. Like it
Mm,
doesn't belong to the bigots and the bullies and the haters and the people who are just so repressed that they love to project and purge the things that they're unwilling to look at in their own lives.
yeah.
Like that's not Christianity. And that's what it's become. And it's really sad and it's an embarrassment to the point where I'm like, I genuinely consider, do I want to abandon this entirely? Is this actually like,
Mm,
you know? So one, it doesn't belong to those people. They are not the definition of Christianity. They are a mutant
mm,
abomination of what has become of American evangelicalism. And it's horrendous. I want to be very clear about that. It's gross. And I don't agree with most of it. Um, but those people don't define Christianity. They don't own it. They don't have the authority for that.
mm,
Two, Jesus is still an incredibly compelling character to me.
mm.
His message, his story, his work. If we can strip the evangelical toxicity and the biblical literalism and genuinely approach the text with like understanding the authors and the way they wrote things and who they were writing them to and for what purpose, I think the character of Jesus and the work that he did is still incredibly relevant and inspiring and compelling. I don't need Jesus to be my Lord and Savior anymore. I don't need Jesus to like save me from hell or die for my sins, which would tell a lot of people would say, well, then you're not a Christian. I'm like, you don't get to say that. So think it all you want.
Mhm.
That's fine. That's not yours to call.
Yeah.
But Christocentric values, ethics, priorities, like that's Christian to me.
Mm,
And thirdly, the people I actually want to speak to and help that I think a lot of my experience and education lends toward are trapped in the evangelical world, and I want to help them. The people who want to stay there and want to double down and defend the oppressive, nasty, white, evangelical, patriarchal, we can go, if they want to defend that, fine. Do that. I don't care. I'm not talking to you. The
mm,
people who are willing to hear their conscience and face the ethical questions that a responsible person would look at and are genuinely ready to learn, I want to help those people. But then underneath that specifically, I would like to help the queer people who don't know that there's another way, who don't realize that they can actually still have faith or spirituality and drop all the toxicity. Like that's actually possible. I would like to embody the example of that. You can do it. And it's not just me. There's so many of us, right? But I'd like to be another person who steps onto the stage, who's visible, who represents, you can still be a person of faith and be gay. You can. They don't get to take that from you. They took so much from you. They don't let them take this. It's
mm,
not theirs. They don't have the right. But that matters to me. So because of those probably three main reasons, I still hold the label Christian pastor. I don't even want to be a pastor. I don't want to use that term.
mm.
It's not helpful, but for the people I'm trying to reach and the context within which my content goes, I think it serves its purpose. So I maintain it, and it's costly to hold, but I think it's at this point in the process still worthwhile.
Yeah. I mean, essentially, what I hear is the gay Christian pastoral version of Taylor Swift. I mean, that sounds fabulous.
Done. I'm in. Okay, I can be that guy.
Yeah, I mean, who doesn't want to be the Taylor Swift in someone's life?
Wow, I love it. That's amazing.
Oh, and so, okay, so I've been finishing all of these episodes by asking, what would you say to someone who is fresh in their deconstruction, fresh in their questioning, they are deep in it?
So hang on, they're new. They're just now doing it. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
I would say so. I run a deconstruction book club right now. We're gonna go on a journey. We just are in the middle of our first book, and I tell them. So I'm gonna say this out loud here. I would love for you to give yourself permission to take your time. You don't need to hurry to any conclusions or to get rid of anything necessary. Hurry getting rid of the toxicity and the harm. Put some urgency on that.
Be safe.
But
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. But as you like unravel, like tear up the roots of your conception of reality, let's take our time. Let's be a little patient and like intentional with what we're getting rid of and what we're holding on to. And so I'm like, I understand you're gonna like get rid of some boxes and you're gonna create new boxes to just move into. And those new boxes you will have to move out of again too. But I'm like, that's okay. That's okay. Like I want to give all of you permission to just create new boxes that you will get rid of in 4 months. Like that's fine, right? One rung at a time, like on a ladder. Like let's say we're going down this long wall. Take one rung at a time. Don't jump off the building. That journey is harmful to you. It is overwhelming. It's scary. It's difficult to recover from. I think it does some damage. So instead, maybe just one rung at a time, take your time, but do the work, and continue to process through it. Don't leave it off for too long. Like keep going, do the work. So I would say like take your time. Don't be slow and don't like drag your feet. Be intentional, like baby steps. Don't just tackle everything all at once. Don't just like, because it can just this stuff is not just information. It's not benign pieces of data. This is attached to senses of meaning, identity, belonging, the cosmos, the divine, the afterlife. Like these are important things that make up our worldviews. Don't just rip all of that away that it's just not constructive. And I wouldn't have said this a couple years ago, but having done this work for this long at this point and watching a bunch of people go through this process, I'm like, hey, let's one rung at a time. You can go down the ladder fast. If you're doing one rung at a time faster, that's fine. I don't mind if you want to go quickly. Just one rung at a time. Don't jump because it hurts. The impact is devastating in very important parts of your worldview.
Yeah, absolutely. I often will tell my clients, slow is fast. Whilst ever you are being intentional, slow is fast because, you might think that you're going really quickly, but that doesn't always end in a really helpful, constructive, and growth-giving way. So yeah, I love that. Thanks, Mike.
Yeah.
Thanks for
This
joining.
is way more involved and emotional than I was expecting. My God.
I mean, I've had a few people say that, but then at the end of it, they're like, I probably should have assumed, considering you are a therapist, that and it is titled Beyond the Surface. So I don't want to just skim on top.
Listen,
Let's just dive deep
yeah.
down.
And in your defense, you
Yeah.
you know what? Yeah, a therapist with a podcast called Beyond the Surface. Like, what did I expect? This is my fault. This was amazing.
But thank you. I appreciate it. I think in every episode, the privilege is not lost on me to hear people's stories firsthand. So I appreciate it.
Yeah. Thanks for having me. I'm honored to be here.
Thanks for listening to Beyond the Surface. Until next time, take care, stay true to who you are, and remember, your voice and your story matters, always.